Ode to a War Cemetery by Colin, Raine. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, filled with our eternal brave. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, each one of them is just a kid. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, doing what all the other kids did. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, a big adventure to fight the foe. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, say farewell and off we go. A grave, 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 a grave. Mother's wailing just overcome. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, for one last kiss from her beautiful son. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, he's standing proud and bold and calm. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, as she's clinging on to his outstretched arm. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, turning his back on all that beauty. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, to loyally serve his call of duty. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, now just a number as he marches away. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, with his Uncle Fred and his half-cousin Ray. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, and his lifelong friend, that snotty kid. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, they played soldiers with a dustbin lid. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, bang, bang, you're dead, they both would shout. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, and up they'd get after playing out. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, tomorrow they'd be doing it for real. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, mud round their necks in some foreign field. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, oh what fun to take the prize. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, and drain the life from an enemy's eyes. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, what could be easier, we've done it before. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, a simple task, it was only war. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, sat next to strangers in crowded trucks. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, it wasn't like this in our childhood books. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, the sweat, the fear, suppressed but there. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, trying to be a man so hard to bear. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, only used to his own neighbourhood. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, now heading away lonely to a far-off wood. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, Uncle Fred and Ray left without goodbyes. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, family disappearing before his very eyes. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, Snotty's still there, his only link. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, to the memories, to the kitchen sink. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, a brainwashed generation destined to fall. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, to secure the future for once and for all. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, then shipped away to a far-off land. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, rifle and bayonet in hand. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, cannon fodder or wartime heroes. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, hundreds and thousands and a couple more zeros. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, too many souls for us even to compute. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, sacrificed and now lying mute. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, the end was different but always the same. A grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, mutilated, disfigured by a foe with no name. a grave, a grave, a grave, a grave. The enemy who left his neighbourhood straight, a grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, whose mother wept bitterly when he took to his feet, a grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, to fight our soldiers with just one aim, a grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, to cause destruction, to kill and to maim, a grave, a grave, a grave, a grave. He too lies in a reverent field, a grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, protected by a heavenly shield, a grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, a waste of breath, a waste of life, a grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, never to know the love of a wife, a grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, never to know the pride, the joy, a grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, of their own little girl and their own little boy, a grave, a grave, a grave, a grave. Sleep well, you brave hearts, we'll tell your story, a grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, we'll celebrate your lives with glory, a grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, don't ever let this happen again, a grave, a grave, a grave, a grave, put an end to this madness with a big amen, a grave, 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 a grave.